당도 이르쇼게 제 좀더마위기 시 따줍디 아니 산지기 송비기 돌려야 되려 템바이나 아니 가르 템바레라나 되데바다 제라마던 되디비기 따줍기 때 아니 콜로당 볼야 템바 조 안텔레 공도 어레스 아니 데네 우마베기 따와디 아니 야 콜로 바와레야 공도 데네 삼점배 따와디 아니 콜로 타마레야 도스 공도가 되데 도스 공도고레 제가 데네 자다 콜로기 림바 숨기 캬바 아니 송위기 뒤 지유다 아니 죄자다 안디 지기 체드지 두샤 고랑 디시 쇼게시 아디나시다 아다 좀더 마와시 따르기 아니 삽케티 캬바디 아니 룬라테네 야와 체고 샤고레베 리발리 리베티네 체고레람나 네 룬라테네 두비아데레 칼라카고레 디인자 리베티네 체고 리발레테네 제가 체고레스 제가 제잔 따르기 삽케기 남바디 데니게 샤하고 체고레스 아디 쇼가도 디고레 셰르바다
Good afternoon. So this morning, we looked again at the classification of the Buddhist teachings into the 4 different philosophical schools and saw that each of these schools are based on specific teachings of the Buddha, specific sutras. So the teachings upon which the Vaibhashika and Sautrantika base their teachings, so those are the teachings comprised in the first wheel turning, and were taught at Varanasi. And in the second wheel turning, these are the teachings upon which the Madhyamaka teachings are based. And here the Buddha taught these teachings at Vulture's Peak. Then the teachings of the Chittamatra philosophical school, those of the third wheel turning, were taught in Vaishali. So we saw that all the different Buddhist philosophical tenets have as their basis sutras, teachings by the Buddha. Thereafter, we looked at how can one differentiate or divide the different philosophical views if they're all based on sutra. Can one do it on scriptural authority? And we saw that this is really not possible. The discussion over which would be superior and which would be inferior, that discussion would never come to a conclusion. Rather, one must rely on logical reasoning.
아데네 자당한 저 상주 점내디 송셰비게 송비게 송델라야 네 장된다 녜든기 캬브를 장에게 캬브를 채고 우리 세대당한 저 장에게 캬브라라게 되다 델라야 지나 상이기 송바 나신 직지메지 나신 아니 된델라야 지게 된디 아니 공부 현도 채고야 되네 용거래 된다 공부 현도 채고야 된다를 마치 지메지 제외나 다다매되긴 뒤된다도 공부 현도 채고야 근데 공 제세 장애 세대 니들 공부 제약이 되들이야 근데 장등이 또 세야 돼 언도시네 다 공부 현도 제 먹어봐 자 지신바 송켈린바 켈린 리베들이야 아직 니등이 또 세대 내게다 장애기 켜봐 되네게 체야라서 봐 여바리 되네 자디 장애 채고리 켜봐 채고리 송거로
Also mentioned that when analyzing the sutras, one can analyze them and come to understand which are classified as having a definitive meaning and which as having an interpretive meaning. So sutras, or teachings by the Buddha, that are included amongst those which are interpretive, these require further investigation. They do not present a final reality, the final view. Whereas those sutras, which are classified as definitive, these do not require further investigation or analysis, as they do explicitly present the final view.
Bendigo sanyi sung telya an cheba che du chen jang ge yawa che ko ban za sanyi gar sung ro sene tele chi tela ge long da gam khe nam ge se che da wi se shin do lia ba da wa la ngi ga lang wa che yu gu shi means on song ba
Resuming where we concluded this morning, we come to the verse at the bottom of page 3, which is from the Sutra of Dense Array. Monks and the wise and learned should, like gold is tested by melting, cutting, and polishing, examine my words well before accepting them, and not merely out of reverence for me.
Gelon da gam kenam ji side that den hu sun se de la gelon mong bu ora da jisan gelon choron zo dang se ora da gelon da side gelon choron zo se da gam side ne da gelon mayin ba din na ya ji na ji ki rab jung kim ba de ne ki chue ki kha ba mong bu de ne kha ba choron zo se ora da gelon da gam kenam ji side gelon da da gelon mayin ba de ne ki rikbi nam je ya go ne kha ba choron zo ki 가르쳐 오래 랍나 개남기 시대 다 너무 배지 숨고래 세제 달위 세진도 레버 달랑 세제 달위 세진도 시대 변에 당보지 숨을 배지 세른 총바디 얘기 세르디 직 도도 쉬어배나 제바지도 지로다나다 세르 직세르 응어버지 세르로 통변에 세르 도디 지부지게나 세르 이민하고 말 세르 마인바 지부지게 용식으로 와대자 델레 세르데 심주주 녀도갑라 아니 세르데 갑벨 치로데레 세르게 지주 나로 세르 마인바 용식이래 진짜 니네 자 세르 총바디 가르치고 와서 두스나 다르체 아니 다고레스 세르응네 이민 나로야卷도미도 안디나데 양치 뚝제 제제 파 뚝제 더 기기리와 양시 세르 마인바 주샤 용식으로 파 제제 제네 뚝네 따르 낭로다 치로다 차상 세르 다다 레면도 심주치고래 세르 총바되게 세르 녀도갈바 지사 세르 파 멜당보 멜자제 네 세르 등원에 이민 제바제야다 양지 돌파 두 스타르제 세르 등원에 이민 제바제야라서 봐 양파 뚝제 낭로도卷도면 제바 세르라 세르원에 레도면 두 제바지도 세아바 멜 세아바다 제바는 다르네 두치네 세르리아 심주치고래 디네 세르 심주네 다 딩원에 세르원에 다卷호나 다 낭로디와 짜다 디네 어디 치로데 세르 낭로 짜도 어디 그 주마도 디야고면도 세야다 반직 디로와 진짜다 차상 두체와치도 원에 다네 세르원에 임바卷gün에 매바나 다 세르원에 샤선 세르레와 당어 다바자 녀야 디치고래 진짜 세르리아 총바디기 세르뉴리갑로 두치고 제바치고레스 디나신서다 갤론다 캐남기 세르 켜론주 갤론다 갤론 마이베 켜론주 캐바 남주리버 유겐디기 아니 렉바 달라 니가 세데 니 순시비 최 송디게랴 아니 켜론주 제바치고레스 고 심주야 우제 남보니 안바 돈달라 삼다 안에도 제바치고레스 렉바 달라 니가
The first line in the verse, monks and the wise and learned, this then refers to the audience being addressed. So both ordained and non-ordained were the audience the Buddha was addressing with this verse. And then he goes into an illustration that just like a gold merchant would examine a nugget before purchasing it to see if it is a genuine nugget or not, and the gold merchant would examine through melting, cutting, and polishing. So in other words, in varying ways, the merchant would examine the nugget, not just a brief cursory examination, but thoroughly would examine the nugget to make sure that it is a genuine nugget. And then similar to how a gold merchant approaches his or her business, we should approach the words of the Buddha. And this then comes to the third line. Examine my words well before accepting them. So again, hearing the words that I am teaching, don't just accept these, but analyze them well, investigate them well, just like a merchant does a gold nugget before purchasing it.
야고 심중에 손주마 제바체 심주체 되는 ngoy니스는 튕규도 민도 튕규 지산 튕바듬바나 되네 ngoy니스 제바체제 ngoy니스 튕비기 따라 지여바 하고요도 Then the Lama Jai said, the Yamlin Chehores, Dele Lama Jais, the Yamlin Chehores. Guichi Min said, Jeba Guinea Majevache, and Osanji, Sumare, Dagares, and Dagaran, and Munzugi, killing Shebana, and Delia, and Tata Chegmare, or that is. Sanji got Sanji the Bay, Massa Zachimbushuri, Sanji Gyomar, Sanji Sunshabares, and Darang, killing Baina, killing Jandu Shabana, and Tata Chagmares, when it's the Midimba Yungures, Tenenza, Dambo Shimju, Jabache, Shimjuya Wuch, and Sunyaki Duna, Sunyaki Dengu Cheshati, Ma, Gargar Sungu, Dengu Chesha de Jabache, Gargar Sungu, Sumba Nashi, and the Sumbi Dundela Jabache, when it's how that in Yamlin Cheshos, Lawar Jay, Yamlin Che, Mado, Jeba Guinea Macheva, and Jig Lamsa, and the Goas, or the resident called Munis, Midimbaroche, how go and Adi, Sanji Sunres and Dinis Shavana, Didigmares, called Digomareges.
The verse concludes, and not merely out of reverence for me. So looking at these, the last two lines, examine my words well before accepting them, and not merely out of reverence for me. So here, Buddha Shakyamuni is encouraging his followers to examine his words, examine his teachings, not merely accept them because, oh, this is what the Buddha said, I consider myself a Buddhist, therefore I accept this view. That is insufficient. When the students of the Buddha need to use their intelligence, their critical analysis, the skills of logical reasoning, to examine his words, to see whether his teaching is whether a particular teaching is in accordance with reality or not. And independence on this process of analysis, when the student comes to see that a particular teaching is in accordance with reality, then the student should put it into practice. This is the method for the Buddha's teachings, the Buddhist teachings, to have a maximum impact on the way of thinking of the student. Whereas if the student just merely accepts out of reverence for the Buddha, that is insufficient for those teachings to have maximum impact on the student's mind.
Then some city soon digi, tubigi, tiki, dondala, gargala, donda, garja, the gargari thing to Chisandi, Ganesha, Seshim Juchi Jeba, Yane, and some Jeba, some sure. The nigger, some the niggers, Jebachin, Dondadi, Nimbo, the Hakoyadu, then Delial, and Gom Yaware, Tursum Gomsum Jaware, said that was Sungor, Chisandida, Chivacha, that it is so.
The meaning here is the same as we hear in other contexts, with an important approach of hearing teachings and reflecting on their meaning and then meditate on them. I mentioned this in brief last night, and I'll mention it again now because it relates to what's being presented here and is of such great importance. We need to continually gather new knowledge through hearing teachings, through reading texts, and do so continuously so as to reinforce what one has heard before as well as to hear what's new. And whilst hearing, also engage in reflection on that meaning. So use one's intelligence, reflecting or contemplating the meaning of what one is hearing. And also when one is alone, away from the teachings, continue to contemplate and reflect on the teachings. And in this way, when one comes to know the essence of the teachings, then one is ready to engage in meditation on them. So first, just as an aside, to repeat what I, as the translator, said last night, in that context, the word meditate, it will mean means slightly different, has a slightly different meaning from how we generally use it. Generally, meditation would include reflection and what is meant here by meditation. So that's just an aside. Now, returning to the text over the page, the top of page 4, the text continues. In his Ornament of the Mahayana Sutras, Maitreya commented thoroughly on the meaning of the Buddha's intention in that statement and set forth the 4 reliances. Then, expanding on or explaining the meaning of that crucial verse that we just looked at from the sutra, then Maitreya, in his Ornament of Mahayana Sutras, presented the 4 reliances. And then just to say again as an aside, we have them explicitly in our text, but in the Tibetan, they're not. This verse isn't directly quoted. And what are the 4 reliances? Well, we have them here in our verse, but it's what one should rely on, what one should have confidence or trust in. So first should be the teaching or the Dharma. Second should be the meaning of the teaching. Third should be its definitive meaning. And fourthly should be direct realization or exalted wisdom in relation to the meaning.
어디디 benengazu chue sungandele sangye da ane ji gombo lurubla sobada kya pandrubla sobada bene ji 어디디 pandru gombo lurubla sobada pandita sumbege de muini su de yimba sombaine adadi ngade di keling me dadi sangye sangye re wo sungyo de sangye somba di keling se de sangye gansala tyene chigi twandala samma 마다지 순간 가사라 되제 어디 켈링이 있어봐이나 이 가사를 좀 봐자로 그래 그래서 다 순간 가사라 맞된 봐죠 순간 가사제 상계 있나다 자주선 바이나다 아니 미지부지여 바나라 깨라 첨부지나 깨라 메간지 미지여 바나다 지금 라마지 있나다 라마 깨라 첨부지 있나다 디 멤버게다 라마 마행게 계시지 임바다 디니게 정한주 수익 송부이네 최셰디 밀레 맞된 봐제 디 송예기 식 최들이야 간의 시기도 최간의 쇠샤 될 제바체제 아니 제바체는 최들라 어디는 제바체 되네 최기 니수다 하고제 이시 제반 어디 야구도 선배기 따다레샤 선배기 이시 제바에는 가사라 미된바 최래 된바서 최래 된세 디소 나 된다 최들을 된다 세 송예기 최들을 된다 들기네선 최들이야 sung chue de sam ni ne ma ta ji o de da bi ke ra chen bo lama di ke ra di sung ba re da din sa ta ra re sa ba na di da da che ma re sa ji sa de shi san ye chum de ni sung ba na sung re mi ka re se ne khon zo lam sa killing ko yo ma che ba che bu re sung di da ji sa ga sa la mi tin chue la di sa di da cha go ji sa mi ke ra chen bo da di sung re se lam sa mi killing yo ma di donda le che ba che chue gi ni su de che ba ha go che go re sa ji sa di 강사 라 미팅 쳐라 댄스 강사당 강사 순간보 강사 대당 순위 취니 나네 만주 가르리 이치 짐주 제제 제화선 당보 순에게 취될 바 제바제 될라 이치 제고래서 그래.
The first reliance, as we have here, rely on the teaching, not on the personality, or it could be more literally rely on the teaching, not on the individual. What one is being guarded against, warned against here is guarding against relying on the personality or the individual first and foremost, rather than what they have to say, what they are teaching. So someone who says, oh, I'm not so interested in what Nagarjuna or the other pandits had to say, I'm a follower of the Buddha, I only rely on the teachings of the Buddha. Here, such a person who's not thinking about the teachings but just the personality is making an error. Or similarly, someone who's taken in perhaps by someone's personality, their charisma, or their reputation, then they are relying more on the individual than on what the individual's teaching. Or some people are very taken in by a teacher's title, whether it's Lama or Geshe or whatever, and they're taken in more by the individual than what they have to say. So what Maitreya is advising us against is not to place the emphasis on the person, but rather on what they are teaching, and listen more to what is being said rather than the character of the person who's presenting it, their personality or their title, etc. Place the emphasis here, place one's reliance on the teaching rather than on the one who is giving the teaching.
지게 천년다 첨부 명 첨부에 되게 아니 최근 내수로디 아니 다다라 마신 바네나 베네 되네게 송바이나 아니 델야 아니 저기 지게 되네 순간 직제 아니야 지 지망 먼저 파다베네 배 구수 교로다 아니 지게 지게 명담년다 첨부 매되게 되네게 송취 송야 돼 다다로 지 송야 다다学位呢 但俺就去年底搞不了，大就搞了，每年的我的每的，但是这个他当年的前面咱们就搞出了，现在当年的全部就是给他钱，那没这个月份，这这里啊，年啊出来的，年就快些的，大家的比起钱给用西巴的，等于人家这里去送人的了呀，这个给他全部当民全部有没有什么当话去？ 그 송에게 최이기 된다디 만호와지다 야후주여베이나 송어볼래야 게라 전부 유매다 개발요 말해서 왔다 같이 최디 냠는 제야디 이제 디냠는 제고 그래서 거로와 된다다.
The main danger we are being warned against here is to be taken in like people often are in the world by a teacher's charisma or their reputation or their fame. Because in general, people, as students, can all too easily be drawn to someone who's charismatic or is spoken of very well, who has a great reputation. But those qualities, such as charisma or fame, do not necessarily equate to the person being particularly learned or realized. And then conversely, someone who is learned and realized but is not particularly eloquent in their expression, or maybe their physique is not so appealing. What they say may be precise and based on unmistaken knowledge and experience. So what they have to say could be of great benefit to a particular student, but that student is rather drawn to someone with a particular reputation or charisma, who may not be as skilled a guide. So here, in the first reliance, rely on the teaching, not on the personality. One is being warned against, or encouraged rather, to rely on what is being taught, and less so on how it's being taught.
Denigi Gansala Danger Lamsan Diri and Yamlin Charachin Chedi, Shushe, Dara, some Javaina, among Banadu, Shimbuchede, Nesudi, and the Hagoid, that didn't Tarameva Hagodu, didn't Lamadelia, or that Digi Lamati Kotasha, Jun Sheshas, and didn't answer Loktakiada, Gangadili Gorova. It's not Dambo Corona, Shimbuche, Lamsa, or the Gerashim Digi Sunshas and the Shimbu Machi, Tara di Chevaina, and the Nutrition secrets. It's not Dini and Zanga to Tambon Coronia, to Shin Lamsa, Gerard Migi Matavache, and then what Chetel Pass, some Dadi Cheshella Carasun Donda Garas, to Ocean, Ningan the Chevache, Donda Chetel, some Tamurese, it's not Diniria. It's not a Sanjigi. Sanji Sunshi Che in a Lamsa, Taharana, it said the Kilia Marches and Delation Buche waters. Carson, that Sanjela Ichi or Mara said the Nekis Mariam. The Sanji Sumbares and Tahara Ichi Donda de la Garigova, Sulu Sungibe, Gova Garichi Sungiba Hamoche, Tahara and Noricha cigarettes. Just that the names are Sanji Sungi Chelia. Kazan Shevanaji, Digi Shevanaji Bare, Sanje Sun Chidi Membegi, Mini Nebal Men Devanaji, Chesa, Duji Kamna Mabada, Samba, Tumbi, Koran Negaptilia, Koronia Pandota, Dungasia, Digri, Pando Che, Canisium, Digi Sungore, Denenza, Lamsa, Che de la Sanji Sumbares and Dara to kill him by and Gabriel Notrion Sigri, yes, Urwada.
The onus here is on ourselves to use our intelligence, to listen intently to what's being taught, but use our intelligence to see if what's being taught is mistaken or not. Because especially when it's on a topic that one doesn't know very well, it's easy to be swayed by someone who speaks very eloquently or has a charismatic personality or a famous reputation. And the danger here is that more than just wasting one's time, one can be led down a wrong path. So that is a real danger. Here then, the Buddha is encouraging us, listen with an open mind and guard against being swayed by the superficial. When Buddha gave this advice, he was actually not giving it to those who didn't necessarily have faith in him. He was giving this advice to his students. He was saying, you who are my students, you who already have trust in me, use your intelligence, keep listening with an open mind and analyze and investigate for yourself. Just like the illustration we heard this morning, the doctor will prescribe what benefits, and therefore it may suit a certain situation, but not another. Similarly, a student must listen with an open mind, in an attentive manner, using their intelligence, and examine for themselves and determine whether a particular teaching is relevant for them then and there or not. So the Buddha, this advice from the Buddha, as has been rephrased here by Maitreya, is not merely for those who don't have faith in the teacher, but is also for those who do already have faith or trust in the teacher.
Na Gansala meeting that Chelia Jebache, and in Jebache, the Nico Chuki, then Chele Jebache, and Chedele Ichi, 제고레스 제바치도 니스 하고로와 줄래 데네 디니베딜레 나 최델라야 안데 최델라야 지야도다네 가르요르스네 칙단 되니요레스 칙 지단 칙단 되니요레스 디니나네 나 가르레 제바지 가르리지죠 돈다델라 삼당고레스 칙단 니나네 조 돈다델라 삼당고레스 오레 돈다델라 삼당고레스 지자 베네 가실레 칙디베 닌지고 냥아야고 시에타 송타야고 칙디 닌지보다 되네시 요번에 돈다라 시라메딩에 용고레 돈다 따따메디 용고레스 지나다 칙레 냥아다 베 칙닌지고 시에카보메네 미니 소야들 돈다 따따 송데 돈다디 소야디 돈다디 따따레도네 고디고레 지나 칙단 되니기나네 돈다라 삼당고레스
So hopefully then the first reliance then is clear. Rely on the teaching. Put your trust in the teachings rather than the personality of the one giving the teaching. Then secondly, the teaching is comprised of words, but those words have meaning. And of the two, meaning and words, one needs to place one's reliance on the meaning of the words. So here one is being guarded, one is being warned against being taken in by an eloquent explanation. Because some teachings, a teaching may well be really pleasing to hear or enjoyable to hear, but there may be an error in the meaning. The meaning actually may be going in the wrong direction. So here one needs to pay particular attention to the meaning of what's being said and guard against being swayed by the mere words.
대지 식들로면다 덤바시 소야디 레버 된시 소 대양세 덤바보 간사라 미템버 디 템비 주탐 쳬라 템바당 세데다 가서 디신열 시에다 간사라 미템 쳬라 템세 시디로와 대시디 로면도 대시디 로야 하도 돈다 세상 시에사래 제산 디야 덤바 간스 쳬 덤바바 간사라 미템버 디 템비 주탐 쳬라 템세데 간사라 미템 쳬라 템세데 대시 식디 된다.
And now returning to the text, so what the Tibetan has is not the verse, but everything below the verse. So the first sentence then in the Tibetan, what we have here on page 4, one should not rely on the personality of a teacher, but on the tenets or doctrines that he teaches. So that I've already presented.
dāla dāmbā tā, sīdhī cīk xie kāpā, cīk nīng jīwa, nyēng ngā yā gu yu kī, tēnē lā samā tāng jī, anī dōndā dī liyā, cīk jōshē kī dōndā dī liyā sam tāng jī, anī dōndā dī sam tāng, dōndā dī liyā jē hu rē sī, tā dōndā dī lā tā tā rē dī bā, yī chī dōmbā tā, yī chī, dōndā cīk nīng jīwa tā, tēnē kī nīng jīwa yu na, dōndā dā tā tā rē mē nā, tā gōmbā shiandu jē yā rē sā chī.
The second point, which relates to the second reliance, one should not rely merely on the eloquence and so forth of his words, but on their meaning. So this then too it should be clear. One should rely on the meaning, and to know the meaning, one needs to analyze and investigate for oneself. And if the meaning is correct, it's in accordance with reality, this is what one should rely on, what one should place one's trust or conviction in.
그다음 이네 되라 공시 고바 뭐라 뇌지 숨주 권에스 다시신 바 인야 대인야 된 대삼 내룩 타도 민베 더동 공바 현도 장고베게 장된라 미된바 공바 녜된도 공바 현도 장 미고바 녜된라 된바다 시데 된del라다 된del라 장된다 녜된이 용거레스 세상 녜된다 장된이 나네 장된라 미된바제 조 녜된이 될라 삼당고레스 삼당고레스.
So we looked at the first two of the four reliances, now we come to the third. Rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretive. So first, just before we go to the text, I've made a mistake in the text with the numbering. So the number 4 you can cross out, and the bullet point below the 4, that is the actual number 4. So the fourth one starts with respect to, but and all above that is number 3. But I'll read it all now. So number 3, with respect to the meaning, interpretation is required if there was some other intended meaning in the teacher's thought, if there were a purpose for the teachings being stated in interpretable form, if the teachings were susceptible to refutation, and even if the teaching is explicit or literal, if the meaning requires further interpretation of the final reality, and one should not rely on those teachings that require interpretation of the Buddha's intended meaning. One should rely rather on those teachings that have definitive meaning, that is, which do not require interpretation of the Buddha's intent. So all that there is His Holiness's explanation of the third reliance. And here, in terms of meaning, because in the second we saw one must rely on the meaning. Now this is broken down, that there's a definitive meaning and an interpretive. And of the two, it's the definitive meaning that one should place one's trust in.
공바 신도 장미고 바라 녜된라 된 시대다 더데라 장등기도 세다 녜등기도 세디 니용고래 지사다 장등기도 다 녜등기도 자 장등기도 라비 데 제시 도디시고래다 데라 장된다 녜된 니용고래 지사다 장된다 녜된 데다 만족이다 저 우마 텐주버기고 셰바이나 장된 세디 군주비 쉐샤상라 장된라고 그래 장된라고 녜된라는 동반이들 녜된라고 그래 지상 장된된 녜된세다 우마 텐주비고 루를 셰바이나 양아 저게 장된된 녜된세디 장된세디 안에 지거를 군주된 바제 안에 녜된라도 동반이 세지 송거래
The sutras of the Buddha can be classified into those which present those of which the meaning is definitive and those of which the meaning is interpretive. And whether a sutra is classified or a part of a sutra is classified as definitive or interpretive depends on the subject of that sutra or that part of the sutra. What is definitive and interpretive, what is classified as definitive and interpretive, that is classified in accordance with the varying philosophical schools. In other words, they will present different sutras as being definitive, for example. But here we're primarily looking at the view of the Prasangika. So according to the Prasangika, where a sutra or a part of a sutra is presenting conventionalities, that is has an interpretive meaning. Where a sutra or part of a sutra is presenting emptiness, as understood by Prasangika, that is a definitive meaning. So this is how Prasangika makes the differentiation between a sutra being definitive and interpretive. If the Prasangika view of emptiness is being presented, that sutra or part of is of the definitive meaning. If anything other than that is being presented, that is an interpretive meaning.
동반이 용어서 주제 조어진 댐비기 되게려야 아니 지금 뇌등기 도어서다디 장등기 도다 뇌등기 도어서도 그런 거 주제 장등 뇌등 세대 장등 세대 군주비 취제 뇌등에도 동반이세 지사다 도데려야 장등 도라도 군주비 취 무기 주제 무서 주제 조어진 댐비기 되게려 아니 장등기 도어서디 시고래 다 동반이 뇌등 세대 동반이셔 동반이 무기 주저 조어진의 덴비 되라 다 녀등이 또 세지 다 장등이 되다 녀등이 또 세지 차바라 ten유베도 치고래.
To restate that then, the way the Prasangika tenet divides the sutras into interpretive and definitive is independence on their subject, which all tenets would agree. But for the Prasangika, where the explicit subject is a conventionality, then, or conventional phenomena, then it would be have an interpretive meaning. Where the presentation on emptiness is explicitly or directly taught, then that sutra or part thereof would be of definitive meaning. Or to restate that perhaps more simply, where the explicit subject matter is emptiness, according to the Prasangika understanding of emptiness, then that sutra or part thereof is of definitive meaning. Anything else, any other topic, would be of interpretive meaning.
semzambaru chine 장도게 되다 녀등이 되세야리 가르치 개발치 월세네 어저기 동반이던 군주비 취고 시기시고 말해 거기서 가르치고서 너에게 지들 숨바 나신 다가란 자지신도 켈린도 루바이나 켈린 추구여가나 디도들이야 녀등이 도세 다 너에게 지들 숨바 나신 자지 지마치신 켈린도 미루와 공바 현도 제고바 유비도들라 아니 녀등이 어쩌서 장등이 도세 두스 개발치 거래 장 되게 지들 숨바 나신 자치신바 켈린도 켈린 미지디게도 는 공바 디던다 공바 현도 제고비 되들라 네 장등이 도세 거래.
For those of the Chittamatran view, when they divide sutras into definitive and interpretive, they say a sutra has a definitive meaning if it can be taken literally. Whereas, if further investigation is required because there is an implicit other meanings, then that sutra is of interpretive meaning. So this is then how the Chittamatrans come to classify sutras as definitive or interpretive. So again, a sutra, according to the Chittamatrans, is of definitive meaning if it can be taken literally.
나 녀든 다디네 장들이 녀든에 대해서지 뒤에 다디네 인자다 아주게 장들라 미데 녀들라 대해서도 다 가르쳐 가르쳐게 대외 남샤 동반이 또 비게 당아서 ten유비고 시야데 동반이 또 비 로디 계제 니곤발에 때네 아주 녀모바 방고로바 탈바타 탈비고 방 토라야 녀모바 방고레 안에 산지고 방 토발에 녀모바 방고레 제자 녀모바 방비 디바 방비게 녀모소 어디 가서 동반이 또 로디레스 제자 동반이 또 로디 인자 동반이 또 발라 안에 녀든지 되지래 되네 디 바 제바제제 또 얼마도 장등이 돌아되네 안에 동반이 또야지 또 두말스 그러와 그래서 장등이 되갑소 제도 군주비 최대마도 동이 고기니 시고 말아 지사 대 녀드 지사다 동반이 대이 무슨 대이 도티기 제수 장제 도디 나로야 가르가르 송샤지 제바제 되네 제바제네 녀드 유 동반이도 또 그래서 지사 장돌라미데 녀드라 대에서 도스네 또 동반이 때문에对接所长对这个接所长的地段那个决下来了怕心就动办一点那心就接把接呢接把接的能动也多过了其实动也多半在的啊那动办一点的热下身边的心定给一起的离过了吧知道这等也对了长对了没点也对了点下第四个
Our text primarily, our text is presenting the view of the Prasangika. So again, let's look at how the Prasangika differentiate definitive and interpretive sutras. If the sutra presents the view of emptiness and how to cultivate it within oneself, and the understanding of emptiness that the Prasangikas have, then it's the sutra of definitive meaning, because it's according to the Prasangika view, it's through cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness that the afflictions are eradicated. So it is the wisdom realizing emptiness that is the antidote to the afflictions. And it's through cultivating the wisdom realizing emptiness that both liberation and enlightenment are achieved. So the wisdom realizing emptiness is required to attain liberation as well as enlightenment. Therefore, if a sutra, if the subject matter of the sutra enables the student to cultivate the correct view of emptiness and thereby cultivate the antidote to the afflictions and lead to the attainment of liberation and enlightenment, that is a definitive sutra, and this is to be relied upon. All other sutras are interpretive because they do not lead, through relying on them, one will not develop a realization of emptiness. So it's not that they are necessarily faulty, but they do not lead to the realization of emptiness. So that's how Prasangika differentiate between definitive and interpretive.
다 장들에 군주비 최된비게 돌려야 퇴삼검송 롭종 마시 라이 고에게 냥아요다 대야직 디스무고 말와 지나 군주비 최된비게 사다 람게 림바다 데네기 미다바다 둥아와다 아니 지기 미다베 람게 림베 땡들야 대 파신 주침바 수준 저발로 저대 대술려 퇴삼검송 제고를 냠낸 제고고와 이내 데네기 제바전 동방인데비 도딜려 롭종 마제바 디네 직부지 다되바이나 동방이 또 두고 말해서고를 제가 제 동방이 때문에 도실이야 한때 퇴섬제고래 동방이 또 퇴섬제고 지상에 될때 제가선 뒷동이 또야라 동이 또 발라 아니 아주 녀모 방고 녀모 방 동방이 또 별로데 대위 탈독디 또 후고래 뒤또 발라 아주 제바제제 아니 가를 제바지고스네 담보 땡기 흉 될라때네 아니 파 퇴섬곰숨 제고래 담보 퇴바지 디네도 나 삼다 디네 삼다 고면도 동방이 제바지 동방이 또 후고래 해서지 지순거마다야 지게 장돌에 미팅에 될라 땡시데 다 장둥게 땡 군주비 취 남제 땡 돌다 퇴섬제 롭자 제고서 말다 동인도 별로 돌에 퇴섬지전 지사르선베기 삼무지어로 안디세고 말다가잖아.
It's important to understand this third reliance well, because it's easy for a mistake, a harmful mistake to be made. Rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretive. I've presented now what, according to Prasangika, will count as a sutra being of definitive meaning as opposed to interpretive. Those which are definitive present how to realize emptiness in accordance with the Prasangika presentation, and all others are interpretive. That's the meaning here. What it doesn't mean is that those which are interpretive should be abandoned, that they should be ignored, that they are not to be trained in. That is a mistake. That would be a mistaken understanding of this third reliance. Because included within the sutras which are interpretive, as well as then of course the commentaries onto these interpretive sutras, will be presentations on impermanence, presentations on the cultivation of love and compassion and bodhicitta, as well as generosity, ethical restraint, patience, and so forth. All of these need to be trained in, whether one's striving for liberation or enlightenment. These need to be trained in. So again, just because a text may be of interpretive meaning, it doesn't mean that it should not be trained in, that one shouldn't hear teachings on it and reflect on it, the teachings, and then meditate on the meaning. Doesn't mean that at all. What it means, though, is where the sutra is presenting how to realize emptiness, then that we can take as a definitive sutra.
number mido be yeshela tyong ba yin so re oh ji za nge den de ya ni da na je be nam she la mi tyong par number mido be yeshela tyong ba yin se Miedun de yang.
Now then we come to the fourth reliance. So what we have in our book with the last bullet point, so that's our number 4. With respect to the definitive meaning, one should not rely on a dualistic consciousness, but on a non-conceptual exalted wisdom.
아니 이실에 뛰는 시도 갈 수 없으나 다디 남실에 미디엄 바 이실에 뛰는 시 넘버 쉐바데 이시 니 나네 이실라 이시체고 뛰고 이 델레 뛰고 그래서 이 델레 뛰고 그래서 그러와 제자다 남실에 미디 이실에 뛰는 시데 가르르라고 그래서 남실에 시도 니나 마누비 니나 유딩에 쉐바데 라시오라 니나 유딩에 추위 쉐바디게라 아니 델레야 아니가 저기 추위 시야바 제술라 다가랑 제네 아니 이시제 아니 샹다 아다 이실이야 삼마다와제 되버네 아니 타도 주투 말이스 제가 되는 자다 니낭 배나서 왕셰디게 추위 시야 니나 이건 제가 왕셰라 나와나 신가도 다가랑에 삼다네 디 무인이 수디 도투 말이스 전에 제바 제제 안도신 로고래서다 안디나신 동반이 또바네 동반이 또선다 동반이 담보 동반이 달라디나 또베 또고르와 또바디 또이디 또바디 동반이 또베 동이 또고리나 고 니나여데래 콜야 추위지 고 추위디로 가서는 갈래 데라 뎀버주반 데 가소레 돈이 된지다 돈이 지금 많이 지도 되네 난고래 나와서 고 추위디거래 세상 데 어당에 돈이 또 선심제 근데 디고 곰제 영원숨 용원 마주 유에 탑신바다와제 다가라지 데네 아당아 돈이 또 서서서 다가라 샤선 디기레베선 디디 말에 제가 디기 산지고 탈바다 탐지기베 고 토투말 돈이 또바 있나야 세상 돈이 또바 있나야 아니 내 균균에 매바 원수명고 돈이 또 불러디 원수명고 유튜브 내려야 아니 곰디체지 디 원수명고 유고 그래서 그러다 남실라 미디에 예시를 띄어서 예시에서데 넘버 미도베 예시 돈이 원수도 예시데 시고래 내 내려야 규례 기합제 냠ny지체 되네 디규례 기어데 되네 다가랑 디 대곰발에 되네 안에 산요고 봐 토고 그래서 자주메고 봐 될레된 토고 산요고 봐야 될레된 토고 그래서 그래 왕셰디게 추셰레스 왕셰 나와나신 다가랑 레 선바이나 무인의 수디 내룩 타도 또 두고 베네신 또 베네가주 메도다 신을 가르나면 왕실을 나와나 다가라 낭여도 가르는 거라서네 왕실을 신질 마도 코랑군에 주바 나도 그렇지 근데 삼다에 다가라 삼바나 무인의 수디 또 두고 말 동반이 또 두고 말해서 그러와 왕셰디 추위 셰바래 디나신 안 동반이 된지 수위 또 바디게 추위 셰바래 진짜 추위 셰바데서라 아니 니나유 된 셰바인자 아니 다가라 디그리에 선배기 대zam네 이참 그러니까 이 셈제 영원숨 또 병오 규례에 답시 맞다 봐야 되는 말이에요. 제가 디네 검제 원숨 또 병오 동반 원숨 또 병오 규 답제 오래서
With respect to the definitive meaning, one should not rely on a dualistic consciousness, but on a non-conceptual exalted wisdom, or as in the actual verse, rely on direct realization, not on a mere conceptual consciousness. So here, one is being reminded that conceptual consciousnesses are mistaken because of the appearance of duality or of dualistic appearance. So, for example, through what appears to our sense consciousnesses is that an object appears to exist in the way that it appears to us. We believe the object to exist in the way that it appears to us. This is because there is a dualistic appearance to our sense consciousnesses. For example, if one sees a flower, it appears to exist inherently or by its own nature, to have some self-existence. This is how it appears to us, and we believe that it exists in this way. This is a dualistic appearance. Similarly, when one is meditating on emptiness and one comes to realize emptiness, one will first realize emptiness with a conceptual consciousness, which means there will be a dualistic appearance. And here the dualistic appearance is that when one realizes emptiness, emptiness is being realized, but it's not a direct realization, because there is an appearance of the meaning generality of emptiness, and these two are mixed. Emptiness itself, as well as the meaning generality of emptiness, these two are mixed. And therefore, there still is a dualistic appearance. Therefore, we are being warned here that when one comes to realize one's object, but it's not a direct realization, but one through a conceptual consciousness, don't be satisfied with merely this. Whilst it's fabulous that the object has been realized, this is insufficient. It is not of sufficient strength to lead to the attainment of liberation and enlightenment. It needs to be developed further into a direct realization. And the direct realization of emptiness is an exalted wisdom. And so here, we need to develop our realization deeper so that we realize emptiness directly. This is the actual antidote to the afflictions, and it is indispensable for the attainment of liberation from cyclic existence, as well as for enlightenment.
가르송으로서네 아다 간사들이야 지균에 지구메바단 대바마제바다 제고민데 그런 거 쳐들이야 지 대화장 지구진 리구다 선배에 아삼로 용시로 간사라 미든 쳐라 된다도 직디게 되네지 오다 간사라 때데 최승원 그런라 때데 셔라 그제 지구를 마시나 리구도와 땅용 제샤는 그런 거 쳐디 아주 냠내진 지구 선배 삼로 용시로 안디야 말에 다 가르소는 간사라 미든 쳐라 된다도 간사 김전의 지에 최대 켈린 최기 된다라 삼마다와네 야기 주고 말해서 최기 된다라 삼당 된다 삼당에 맞나 된다게 하고 또 두고 말해 체매 두고 말해 체매 뭐도 봐이나 아니 나중에 된다리 야기 주고 말해 와서 지상 주니스 사바 신두고 말해 지상 간사라 미든 쳐라 된시도 간사요 김전에 야고 송배나다 간해서나 안지게 어다이고 간사디 깨라 첨보로 고자 첨보에 디송와들에서데 간사 코로나 김전의 제제 최기 된다들 제바 기네 마제바 장아주 다가나 제바네 내가 저기 니스 사바 신야래야 아니 하고도 말 이야기 주고 말해서 아니 그 가브리엘 지다 간사디 송바들 임바 송을 그 마임바 용식을 지가서 너트 이민다 하고도 말해 제가 디네서 간사 송바서 간사 코로나 송바 간사 코로나래야 이제 제거를 이내 디잠기 다가나 마샤바체 코로나 송비 최델이야 간에 송구도 최기 된다들 가르기도 심주체제 송바나제 된다들 두에 민도 제바체 두신 제바체 고래 제바체디 우연에서 추기 된다다 하고 그래서 제사다 하고에도 네 하고나 우연 템바리도 뭐 줌바리도 아니 하고 그러와 제사 되는데 우연에서 하고에도 안주기디 냠내 최들이야 아니 이체다 냠내 제약이 언제 용거리에 세대 가살라미든 쳐라 되세대 대상지 변행한 되면 상계리 사실 송샤네 된 상계 송사와를 대 상계 최들 제바체 하고 요말다 삼당고 말선 진셰반에 이야기 주고 말해지 제가 제바체 고레스 제바체 아니 가르가르 송샤 디송에디 다 딱다 데메바나 안다디 송에디 상계의 송고비 김장 가르에 송사가 술로 송바래 가르치는 송고어래 세 지디 안도 제바지디 대변에 상계 송아질이야 임바도 된다를 제바 된다 딱다 메바이나 메나양 안다 상유 송고바데 가르치는 송바래 술로 송샤 김장 가래 고바 가려라서 제바지에도 되는 송사당 고바당 김장 차사하고 그래서 제가 되는 인상은 저기 어디디 아주 자치신의 켈린도 좀 초대 디케 송와나신 안에 켈린 지금이노스베 야와치 두 그래서 그랬던다 디르와
These four alliances really are important, and the meaning of these you need to incorporate into your approach to the Dharma. And if one does so, the Dharma will be able to transform one's mind. Because looking at the first of the four again, here what one is being advised to do is to place one's emphasis on the teaching itself and not on the personality of the teacher. Doesn't mean the teacher isn't important, that one should just ignore the teacher, but that one's emphasis needs to be on what is being taught. So here we're being encouraged to guard ourselves from getting caught up in the presentation, in the personality, in the way that things are being said, kind of as if one were at a theater. But rather, we should be engaged with what is being said, not with the display of how it's being presented. Our focus needs to be on the teaching itself and not on the presentation of the teacher. And with this focus on what is being taught, we investigate, we analyze, we use our own intelligence to see whether a teaching is in accordance with the Dharma, in accordance with reality or not. And when it is, this is a teaching to integrate within ourselves. And so here we take the same approach as the gold merchant that we had in the preceding verse, as well as in the paragraphs above that, where just like when the Buddha taught, he taught to a specific audience, a teaching in accordance with the time and the place and the audience. So we keep this in mind and we use our intelligence at all times. So this is the key meaning here.
다 직디 닝지오도 세냥아 직닝지오도 선배 다가라 아니 직디 고바증에 다가라 이심제 don달라 삼마다시 되네 디 말레스 제가 직디 닝지오에네 아니 고 don달라 삼마다 don다하고 두마 직냐 don다하고 두마레 지네 직디 닝지오에네 don달라야 다다야 보라메디에 디 용시게 됐어 되네 엔자 직라미드 다 don라드에시도 다 직지부 영아다 직민주보다 되네게 직지보다 이심지 다가라 이심다 지그레선 배 삼다제 돈달래야 삼마다 되베네 디노트리스 제가 되네 인자 직디니 디 돈다들이야 제바제 직디 죄자 돈다디 카르르 샤스베다 되네 제바제 돈다들라 다다 손바나신 직디게 라바네 돈다 두게 민도 된 돈다디 디게 지금도 도시네 심주시에네 안 돈다디 하고 바제 거래서 직라메 돈라 되세요 마도 직비네라 낭매시 자기가 직년고 말쓰고 말에 지산 직대라 다가라 이시제제 돈달라 살마다 되바는 직了되바래 직了되데 닌지오도 배 직년보 야고쇼도 사제 안데라 삼단 가서 되데 돈달라 주네 삼마다바네 되네 직了되바 차로 그래 지산데 직디 닌지보 이나다 돈달데 가는 시에샤디 저샤 가르 땡기도 된데 노세 심주에 가르 땡기도 쓴데 내 제바지도 돈달다 하고요도 아니 하고 두고래. 지나 전에 된다 하고다 먼저 냠슬래디 된다데 가서 냠슬래 고고로 왔어. 지사디 틀레메 된다 된세도 김전디래 된다데.
The second reliance builds very closely on the first. The first we guarded against being distracted by the reputation, the personality of the teacher, and in the second we're being warned against being distracted by the eloquence of what is being taught. So what we should rather be relying on is the teaching, and then not just the mere words, but the meaning. So we see here how the second reliance builds on the first, takes it to a deeper level. In the first, we encourage not to rely on the personality or the reputation of the teacher, and in the second, not to rely on the eloquence of the presentation. But what we are being encouraged to rely on with the first is on the teaching, and in the second, the meaning of the teaching. So what being encouraged to do with this progression is firstly to focus on the teaching and not the presentation, and then focus on the meaning. And by focusing on the meaning of what's being taught, investigate, think for yourself, bring your critical reasoning into the Gompa and analyze. Use your intelligence here as well as in your reflections afterwards.
Gewishin Dinsude Pe Masa Gichimbore, Shizadini Zada Gewishin Tembalaya, Lamsa, Anjige Lamatelia, and Lamina, Lomi Chushi and Kaditu, Lomalia, Tajiata. Then Lomigi na Lamsa Dambone, Lama Matemba, Shimjuja, Taja Chise, and the Jig Dushine, and then Lamaten Kure, Sachi Lama Lomatensula, Diniki Gichimusungore. Jazan Dangazugi, Gansa, Chelamete, Gansa like dear. Chui the Chida Duni in a Chile danger, Gansa, and Chile Demba and danger, or La the Dimiki that get a Chimboresha Sata. Midi get a chimbushi or get a chalama chimbore said, get a chimbore said. And then Zang on the church you said. No church soon at the bed, Yembo the bear, I was soon to us big denigi, sit down, Gansan in the Dutch, Di Dundada, and the church in Dundala, some Mataje, Dush and a Karagar Sungudu, Nuinus a Karaj Jebaj, Chimjuma Chevaje. Signiam Buchida, Sunguda, Mizi Budu, Damia, Gera Chimbudu, Samje, Lamatemba ina. Gabriela, Denigi, Kohota, that Yonsigre, Chesantineza, the Mombana Dene, then Jelia, Ganga Teodu, then Dambo Lama Dancer, then Niba Lama la Diavolo, Lama da Jikata, then the Yungri, Chesadine, so Nigala Divachimbo Sawar, Deneza, Dambon Lama Dea de la Cot. Subsage, Koshim Juice, Milpazu, Kishitiada, and Dushin, Dinku, setting out to Lamatena, Gechim, Sungorua, Jeza, and then the Yungurua, and Chisonalia, Chikitambo, Lama said, Chikti, the bed, Chichiti, Angelia, and the Lama de la Cata, the Lama de Chichi, into said the Cata, Chisona Yungurua, Dena, the Christian Baris, Gansala, Tempata, Sigla Denje, Gansada, Signal Denje, Colama Tempare. Just Dundal Samatare. Jelia Hodu, Shendine, Gangaji, Su de Hago, Chicken, that Leo, then the Shine, or the Notrisha, Simply Guen Tong, then the Guen on the Gunja Ligua, Cezanne de Jungur, Cezadi, subsubject what Gechimure said that, Dinar Sumati, Dara, and the Lamatins and the Sun, Chasade, Gechimo Yusungur, what him.
What is presented here in the Reliances is very similar to what you'll know from the Lamrim presentation, where the great importance of relying on a spiritual teacher is presented near the outset of the graduated stages to enlightenment. And in that topic, it presents about how a student should investigate a teacher before deciding to rely on that teacher or not. So that fits very closely with what is being presented here. Because in either situation, whether one is approaching through the lens of what one studies in the Lamrim or through this verse, one shouldn't be taken in by someone's reputation or their eloquence or the show in front of oneself, because then one is missing what is important. And what's important is not the entertainment or the event, but it's the teaching. And not only is it the teaching that's important, it's not the entertaining aspect of the teaching, but it's the meaning of the teaching that is of great importance. And how this fits so with the Lamrim presentation is that should one be taken in by charisma, for example, and that person is not a reliable spiritual friend, they could end up deceiving one, taking one down a wrong path. And being taken down a wrong path is harmful not only for the student but the teacher too. And especially at the outset, where one doesn't know the Dharma well, or a particular topic of the Dharma well, then this is possible. And then later, when one realizes that actually the teachings one has been receiving are mistaken, then one is in a difficult position. When one recognizes that one has been misled, whether intentionally or unintentionally misled, one then is in a difficult position. So therefore, one needs to investigate a teacher well before deciding whether to rely on them or not. And in the process of investigating well, we can take the advice that's presented here. Rely on the teaching, not on the personality. Rely on the meaning, not on the words.
Samola Mibigi, Midobe, Sem Deyang, Samola Mibi, Topigi, Topa, Sama Gomdesa, Sama Gomde, Gomji, Duna, Sanang Topna, Midobe Scuba is. Tizada, Midobe, said the Canis Curious in Samola Mibi, Samo, Tomba Yishe, Della Mibigi, then Ishi Sam Lodi, and the Samo Tomba Nila, Jeba Topigit, Jacomje, Gomje, then Tomba Yosum Donna, Sana Tomba, Tomba Yosum Dosobana, then Midobe, she said, that she said, when you check what, she's not Tomba Yutoba, Zamji, Uncle Tony Tobi, Tombotoya, Tomba Dunju Tobo, the Topa is a true dear, Toba the tree tree dear. She said, in the Delabayan, a young Gomje, the nigger Tomba Yutobo Lodi, Monsum Yomo Juriovana, then don't you some toy, then he said, but she that middle be she said, the child, Papi, she said, Chagore, she's a Palam said, Chagor, de Tobana, that day, and that delicate Guinea, Tomba to Adelia, Lodelia, you Tomba Nile, Tomba to look around, no Geo mother, Guinea came married, just I did that, the middle be that he says a child, just I did that, Gomje, that Gomje, Nuba, ya, and the Delatine, Sanje Govan Toyada, and the judgment between Toyadi, Delatino Gores, is that, don't you also no matter Bardo, and the Delia, Tony to Loti, Tahara, the Tos has that Congo Mess and the Masha Wachem, Yane and the Gomje, Queen Chazan, Tony to Lodilla, true now, true now, true now, the members of Tamas said that, don't wait to Tower, the Guinea members of the Guinea member said, Gomje, don't you want some toy, that call Guinea member Chagor.
The fourth point then concludes, in this regard, a non-conceptual mind that observes the profound is cultivated as a conceptual valid cognizer that apprehends the profound. When a clear appearance of the object of meditation arises, this develops into a non-conceptual exalted wisdom. So just to unpack the language a little bit, in this regard, a non-conceptual mind that observes the profound meaning emptiness, and then observes, we could say, is focused on or apprehends emptiness, is cultivated as a conceptual valid cognizer that apprehends the profound. So this then points to the sequence of training. At first, when emptiness is realized, it's realized with a conceptual consciousness. So this is a correct realization of emptiness, but because the consciousness is conceptual, it is mistaken due to the object, the profound object of emptiness, being mixed with the meaning generality of emptiness. So this conceptual consciousness is mistaken, therefore it is not faultless, and it needs to be developed further. And the way it's developed further is through continuing to meditate and eradicate the dualistic appearance, in other words, the meaning generality. And then one will attain a direct realization and an Arya path. And so the verse then, the paragraph continues, when a clear appearance of the object of meditation arises, clear appearance meaning without being mixed, the appearance of the object of meditation is emptiness, and a clear appearance of emptiness means it's not mixed with a meaning generality, and therefore it is a direct realization. This develops into a non-conceptual exalted wisdom. An exalted wisdom is a wisdom that directly realizes emptiness, and it is an Arya path. This is reliable, and this too then needs to be developed further, developed into the attainment of where the practitioner attains the state of a foe destroyer or the state of a Buddha. So what these two lines point to, and the meaning of this fourth reliance, is that even when one gains a realization, this needs to be developed to the point where it becomes a direct realization, and from there developed further into the attainment of one's final goal, liberation or enlightenment.
I want to ask a question. Is that right? In that second sentence there, in regard, that second sentence of number 2, to me it sounds like, in this regard, it sounds like you've already got a non-conceptual mind that is then cultivated as a conceptual veloconizer. It seems like it should be the other way around. It's been bothering me.
Can I just re-explain the second line? Because I think how it's been translated is perhaps mistaken. Yeah?
Samola mi bigi midok pe shelana midok balana number na zamola mi bi midok pe sem se de tombanye zamose tombanye roa de la mi bigi da midok pe sem se tombanye topiki ji loти sigur mi tombanye la mi bigi lochi midok pe lote yane yando cosa samote la mi bigi topa chema so topa chema roa da 다데디 가르스는 졸람나 솔람네서 동용어수는 마도비 내가서 동방이 또별로디 똑같이마 책으로 마도 무슨 책으로 말 되니게 똑같이마디 사몰라 미비기 똑같이마세디 동방이 또비로 동바 똑같이마디 야네 야도 곰 똑같이마디 곰디에서도 곰데 아니 곰제 돈라사나 통고래 동어숨 주고 어숨 뭐 주고 그래서 예. 나디로와 체마람나 딜레고래 당보 사몰라 미베 똑바시게고라 당보게디 체마 제바체마 차기로 와지자 제자 사몰라 미베 셈세드 동바니 당보 또르디 또베 셈디세월 셈 대양 세월 대양 안에 다당아 돈이 또 사선세 진샤는 지기르비선 지기 말레스 데니게 사몰미베 똑바 체마디 야네 야도 곰바티네 곰주용 오주 데네 야는 오주된 또 무슨 오주 그래서 그러다 마도 심주 시에요다 사몰라 미비기 미도비 셈세 동반에 당보 도비기 제바체마 사지샤는 주고 제바체 셈데 데니게 셈데 제바체 말레스 제가 디 똑바체 말레스 마도 무슨이 참아 말해서 그러다 제가 니네 똑바체 말인자 다디 곰지는 무슨 용어도 주고 그래서 그러다 단다리 나 제바체마 당보 미도 동반이 도비 셈마 수도 제바체마 기로 와 제가 미도 동반이 도비기 미도 바세다 미도 바스네 넘버 미도 바서 템바도 바라시 뭐 마두 바서 그러 당보 도비 셈마 셈 도베 셈디서 데네 당보 도야데 셈마레스 도바 셈마레스 지상 도바 셈마 당아 동이 도베 셈마 계사서선 야세나 디디 마레 디 곰제 무슨 뭐 주고 그래서 미도바라네 제바 미 똑시데 넘버 미도바 가르센 덴버 마주발레 그래 미도바세 미 세데 덴버 두비게 넘버 미도바세 지상 또 세데 똑바시데 똑바 참아와 똑바디와 거등나 저기 응어숨다 똑바이는 똑바 참아래 마도 응어숨 참아 말해서 미도바 가르 미도바 가르미 덴바 마주바 똑바 참아서 그래 똑바다 응어숨 세딜에 양식 요 말봐 제가 동방이 당보 또비기 제바 참아라 똑비 참아라는 사요래 지상 진이 또베 참아데 똑바레베 응어숨레라네 똑바 참아레서 똑바레 응어숨 말해서 진이 똑바 참아라고 디세오래
So just in brief, because I was checking that the Tibetan is right, because the word for non-conceptual is one silent letter away from being realized or not realized, if it's got the negative. But the Tibetan is correct, the English therefore is correct. So Genla's saying that it's referring to when one first realizes emptiness, and it's an inferential realization, but not yet a direct realization, and needs to be cultivated further. So that is what is being referred to here.
So you could almost put is cultivated first as a conceptual. Could you put cultivated first as a conceptual valid cognizer that apprehends the form? In that sentence.
So to rewrite it and say, in this regard,
a non-conceptual mind that observes the profound is cultivated first as a conceptual valid cognizer that apprehends.
Okay. So to put in first as cultivated first as a okay.
Is that what the meaning is?
똑같이 말해. donda tsikdele ringbu swebana samo tomba ni la tangbo topiki jeba chamadi and jeba chamadi tope sem seguro topare seguro tope semres dipara de jeba chama se di chama fa jugo ko da de si samo la mi bi mi doba samo la mi che samo tomba ni limi ne tembar majubo topiki tangbo tope chamadi 체마디 무슨 체마리베 제바 체마리라네 가서 똑바리베라네 똑바리에서 똑베셈 당보디 이제 제바 체마리 지산 똑바 당보 삼모라 삼모 동바니 당보로 똑베기 체마디 안에 똑베셈레서 똑베셈레 무슨 말이에 똑바리 동용 무슨 또야 말 똑베셈레스 다 도베 셈디 사모라 미비게 도베 체마다 되지 도베 셈 도바 체마디 제바 체마리도 봐 도바 체마디 안 도바 체마인장 무슨 체마 말고 도바 체마래 지산디 도바 체마디 되는고 추대요를 추대요를 지산디 검제네 안 검자 동반이 무슨이 도도바 무슨 뭐 교고래서 그렇다.
This entire sentence is referring to inferential valid cognition. So if we read it with that understanding that this is about attaining an inferential valid cognizer and developing that inferential valid cognizer further, and then we come to the next sentence, which is then it becomes the direct valid cognizer. So in the sentence starting in this regard, it's referring only to the inferential an inferential valid cognition, which is attained and developed further. And when it becomes then to the next sentence, when a clear appearance, that inferential valid cognizer here then is becoming a direct valid cognizer.
Now the teaching was ne din sure. Samola mi bi Sam de jing an zung yedun de la jeba che yedun la zhangdun yi ne yedun la jeba che yedun jeba che dangbo dong de yedun zhangdun da yedun se yedun xie xie de de jing an zung zhangdun la yedun la ruwa je san yedun la jeba che hu la ruwa dongba yi la jeba yi de de le ya jeba che de samo de dongba yi la mi bi chama ji de che da chama jeba ne Samola mikpa mikpi midopa mi sede samola mikpa sede mikpi mi sede di bardo di toba ngedun tongba yi tobe chemaji giri esoda tongba yi tobe chema ngedun sede tongba yi roa di tobe chema giri esoda.
So now I present this abbreviated sentence then, or the sentence which has been written in an abbreviated way, in a more expansive way. In this regard, a non-conceptual mind. So here then this is referring to a valid cognizer that is realizing the definitive meaning. So again, it's just commenting thus far on, in this regard, a non-conceptual mind. And this is referring to a valid cognizer realizing the definitive meaning.
Sik di para de jeba se ju go re se de sik du sha de wa je sang ge sik ring bu se ba na sa mo la mi du be na par mi do bi ge chama ki re se di chama de ba mi do ba se mi se de ya tok se de ma ja go re mi se de pa para di para de la chama se pa ju chama ki re se da di chama de ne mo sum re be tok pa re be la na to be sem se ora to be sem re la go da to be sem se di para.
And is this mind then a direct valid cognizer or a conceptual valid cognizer? It's a conceptual valid cognizer. So Genla is making his insertion of his explanation comes between the negation, what you have, non. So between the word non, he's now adding more meaning to present that this valid cognizer is a conceptual mind.
Tobe dit ngosum rebe chemare dat tomai tobe logic kigina chema kigina di topare be ngosum re na topare tobe semre hese antiro la sarva.
So just to be clear, so inserting it that this valid cognizer that is realizing the definitive meaning, it is it conceptual or direct? It's conceptual, not direct.
난 되니게 다 안에 동방이 도배 셈 시대 제바체만 셈 디게서 지나다 다가라 디기를 배선 대한 지금 말해서 제산 대양 삼몰 미표 도배 체마 대양 가르쳐 버렸으네 곰제 오승오 유래서 그래 삼몰 미표 도배 체마 시대 되니게 대시 당보 도배 체마 도배 셈이라서 되니 다 도배 체마이나 되니 도배 체마디 계산 완전다 디기를 배라나 대한 이 지금 말했디 오승오 유 곰제 된 동반이 오승 도바체 오승오 유 그래서.
Then the sentence continues and concludes with the meaning as we have here. Mind that observes the profound is cultivated as a conceptual valid cognizer that apprehends the profound. Meaning that don't stop there, continue your cultivation. So take this conceptual valid cognizer and develop it further. And that's the meaning of the rest of that sentence. And now is it clear?
Yeah, that's much better.
Good.
That's very clear.
Good. No, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Alright, that didn't zade during anzogi shue di garsho sen tembashi and di shoge and the chicken anzo kolosum ge namsha sonya ge yuda and chidu duja and the nege and juja di ma shu and the nea and the chicken anzogi jeba che zo da tembashi go ne samta che jeba che ma do and the chicken di san yu sumbare sa da garan chine duen jeba ma jeba che gansa la due je and da garan chik dan gansa la due je and da garan kelen je duen da la samma da ba na ya ke tu ma chi san duen da la sam dang go re sa che tembashi go ne sam da na du chin ne shi and dia na ma zu ge wi shin na den so da ja ba ne da de du chin ne ge chen bu shu ji ge za on du su shi sen da da de ba dong du shi da duen da ti ti la ka duen da la ning bo de la ka sung go se ne je za da ma zu ge jeba je je duen de sambo tong ba yi duen di to ma tu ba ina nga zu nyom ba pa tu ma re thar ba da tham je ki me ko tu tu ma de ne yin zang nga zu ge jeba je sim ju che sik le ya san da ra sha sha ba ze sik ga de xue be ne sik ge jue xia le pa jeba je jue je de le yang kun zu ge nam cha da ne ne ka so ren ne tong yi ge nam cha nge dun ge nam cha yi na ne pa nge dun ge nam cha de la jeba je nge dun ngui ni su yi chue ga ne rang ge rang xin ga ne tu de le jeba je rang xin tong ba yi to ba je ko re di to ne 다 되네게 또 배당고 또 이제 체마 제바 체마 기오래 또바 체마래 또바래디 지난 지점이 지금 말이 양 곰제 원수명 오 주세 소소게 냠용 용 같은 거 원수명 오 통거래서 다 되네 원수면 돼 밥에 간사 차로 그래 지난 네 곰바든데 탈바다 탐제 김고 봐라 토고 그래서지 don다래 디숨 거 당한다
this weekend, then we've concluded looking at the answer, this extensive answer to the question and the various subcomponents of that. So we spoke about the 3 different wheel turnings and in relation to the 4 different tenets and how they fit together, seeing which of the sutras each tenet relies on and which wheel turning those are to be found. Also spoke about that these were all taught by the Buddha, but there is this difference in presentation because primarily of the different direct audience or the intended audience before the Buddha at the time. Thereafter, this afternoon, we've come to the 4 reliances. And this is something that is important for you to take on and integrate within how you approach the Dharma. And we've seen here also how this fits in with the presentation of the Lamaram and how one should come to know a teacher and see the relationship between the 4 reliances and how to rely on a spiritual teacher. So I'd encourage you then to take these 4 reliances and the meaning thereof to apply to how one interacts with the Dharma. But the essence of what we've looked at this meaning is, the essence of what we've looked at this weekend is to use your intelligence, to use your logical reasoning to analyze, to investigate, to think for yourselves. This is the responsibility that each of us has individually. And how this then fits in what we've also looked at in terms of the definitive and interpretive meaning is that those teachings which are of definitive meaning is determined by us investigating and seeing, is it in accordance with the supreme view of emptiness, the presentation of the Prasangika view of emptiness, and we determine this by seeing whether it helps us develop the wisdom realizing emptiness. And as we develop this, our understanding of emptiness, based on what our hearing and our reflecting, we need to continue to reflect on this, because whatever understanding we have, we need to deepen. Eventually, we'll come to gain a conceptual realization of emptiness. But that is insufficient. We need to develop this further until we eventually attain a conceptual realization that's of great strength. But thereafter, we need to develop that further to where we actually gain a direct realization of emptiness, which is an exalted path, an exalted wisdom, and an Arya path. That needs to be our goal. And until we achieve this, continue to hear, reflect, and meditate, developing our understanding, deepening our understanding. And when eventually we attain an Arya path within us, that too then gets developed further until it becomes the Arya path of a Buddha. Then we'll conclude there, thank you, and we'll continue then from the next outline next time. Thank you.